Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Kitty and I'm an academic junior doctor working in the UK. I recently passed the MRCS Part A exam and I talked about such my immediate feelings soon after I got the results, and now that I've collected my thoughts a little bit more, I thought that today I would share with you how I personally prepare for the exam and some general tips I picked up along the way. So hopefully this is useful for those of you who are looking at surgery as a prospective career and those of you who are looking to take the exam as well. I expect this will be quite a long video, so as usual, all the timestamps are available here so you can jump ahead to the part that you find most useful if you're short on time. But otherwise, let's just jump straight into it. So firstly, what is the MRCS Part A? MRCS stands for the Membership of the Royal College of Surgeons and is an intercollegiate exam you need to take in order to become a member of one of the 4 Royal Colleges in the UK, so that's England, Edinburgh, Ireland and Glasgow. In other words, you need to be able to pass this exam in order to become an ST3 surgical trainee. The MRCS is split into 2 parts, Part A, which is a written single best answers MCQ paper, and Part B, which is more of a Viva OSCE type exam. The Part A exam, which is what we're focusing on today, is further split into 2 papers. Paper 1 is known as the Applied Surgical Sciences paper, and it's 3 hours long with 180 questions, so just about a minute for each question. It revolves around topics such as surgical applied anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, microbiology, imaging, and data interpretation and audit. Paper 2 of the Part A exam is called the Principles of Surgery and is much more clinically oriented. This includes common congenital and acquired surgical conditions, perioperative management of patients, assessment and management of trauma patients, pediatric surgery, and medical legal aspects of practicing surgery. Paper 2 has 120 questions over 2 hours, which again is about a minute per question. A more detailed breakdown of exactly how many questions are in each of those categories are available on the Royal College's website, which you can check out yourself on their syllabus. Historically, the pass mark for the Part A exam tends to be around 70 to 75%, and the pass rate tends to be about a third of the candidates. Every year there are 3 sittings in the Part A exam, usually in January, April and September. In the past, the MRCS Part A exam was usually something that is quite traditional, so you had to go to an exam hall in person, sit down and do the exam with some breaks in between. However, with the pandemic in 2020, this has moved to an online format which you now take at home, and I'll talk more about this later. At this time, it is unclear whether the Royal Colleges will move back towards an in-person exam or continue with online exams for the foreseeable future. So, when should you sit the MRCS Part A? You can take the MRCS Part A essentially at any point as soon as you've graduated medical school. As I mentioned earlier, the absolute deadline for passing the MRCS Part A is right before you apply for a surgical training ST3 national number. However, for those of you who've seen my other videos on CV building, or maybe for those of you who've read ahead, you know that for core surgical training in the UK, you'll be awarded extra points for having sat and passed the MRCS Part A, and also an extra point for having sat the exam but even if you haven't passed it. In addition to this, it is worth keeping in mind that there is some evidence published in the BMJ that candidates who sit the MRCS Part A in F1 tend to have a higher passing rate compared to those who sit it later on in their training. Anecdotally, from my personal experience, I would also recommend taking this exam as close to medical school graduation as possible, and this is because there is a lot of overlap in knowledge in my opinion. Although there is a lot of new information that you have to learn and relearn, especially regarding anatomy and details like that, I found that especially the more niche topics, such as like autoimmune, liver diseases and things, was pretty much at the same level as medical school, and also kind of pediatric presentations of surgical problems as well, which I definitely would have forgotten if I waited another year or 2. I also felt that the knowledge I learned from revising from the MRCS Part A and F1 has also helped me in my surgical rotations as well, and definitely helped me a lot when I went to theatres to see some surgical cases. I was able to identify the anatomy a lot more confidently compared to if I didn't study, and I like to think anyway that the seniors have sort of picked up on that. And another advantage of having sat the MRCS early, and this is kind of anecdotally evidence that I heard from some of my more senior colleagues who are in their core surgical training, is that you then don't have to worry about it when you're a core surgical trainee, and you can just focus on learning how to operate and learning the skills you need rather than trying to focus on an exam. Having said that though, don't feel like because of this you must sit the exam in F1. There are lots of factors of why people sit it later or earlier, but at the end of the day, A is a difficult exam and it's also costly, so only attempt it when you feel prepared. Talking about cost, let's talk about the money, because I think this is something that not a lot of people talk about when they talk about postgraduate exams, but something to keep in mind that the MRCS is not a cheap exam, but then again, none of the postgraduate exams are.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm.
What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm!
Wait.
Everybody calm down! Help!
The MRCS Part A exam itself will cost you about £550 at the moment in terms of the online sitting to book. So that's another good reason to make sure you're absolutely prepared before you apply for this exam so that you just don't lose half a grand. Notably, you can pay the fees of the exam with a study budget from your trust from F2 onwards, but for most of us who are planning to do this in F1, unfortunately, most places do not have a study budget for you to apply to at this stage, so you kind of just have to pay for it out of your own pocket. But additionally, because it is an essential exam, you can also apply for getting tax back from the booking as well, even though that's not really a lot. In addition to the exam, something else to keep in mind is that for question banks and resources that you're going to use to study, it will also cost a bit of money. And this will vary, of course, hugely depending on different people. Some people will spend absolutely loads and buy lots and lots of books, and other people are absolutely fine just studying off of one single question bank. For me personally, I spent around £199 on question banks and an additional £33 on books, excluding the ones that I've already got on my shelves. So that's just something to be aware of. And so with that, let's move on to the study resources that I actually use for the exam. As I said, different people will study differently, and some people will have to buy lots of books and some people don't. Personally, I did most of my revision with question banks alone, with kind of extra reading from books supplementarily on the side, and I think most people will probably tell you the same. Personally, I think question banks are probably the best way to prepare for the Part A exam because it is mostly about pattern recognition. And doing question banks will just allow you to have an idea of what the questions will be formatted like, what sort of information you need to learn, and most of the question banks out there will also contain a bank of information for you to basically use as a reading resource as well. Looking around online, people seem to say that around 3,500 questions or so is kind of the magic number that you need in order to pass. Obviously, there's no evidence whatsoever surrounding this, it's just kind of a number that people seem to have come up with. And I did some calculations, so personally I think I did just under 4,000 unique questions, and including questions that I repeated, like the questions that I got wrong or repeating a question bank, I did about 7,000 questions in the end, which is surprising, but there we are. The main two question banks used for the MRCS Part A is eMRCS and Pastest. I've personally used them both, and there are some advantages and disadvantages for each one. The eMRCS question bank is the one that I mostly prefer. It's quite a large question bank with sort of 2,300 to 2,500 questions, and I think that actually most of the questions on the eMRCS closely resembles what the actual exam questions were like on the actual day. The eMRCS question bank is compiled both by senior surgeons themselves, and it also comprises of people who've just come through the exam who contributes questions that they remember from the actual exam. So at times you will find, and I did find this as well, is that actually when you do the actual exam there are a few questions that are almost exactly word for word the same as the one on eMRCS, so it's definitely one worth getting. eMRCS also has a good textbook resource, is what they call it, which covers all of the main topics as suggested by the syllabus. So if you read through most of the information on there, you've learned pretty much all of the kind of high yield information that you do need to know for the exam. I found that for things like anatomy, I had to do a lot of extra reading on the side, but in terms of the clinical physiology and pathology and that kind of thing, the information on eMRCS was pretty much enough and sufficient on its own and seldomly requires further reading. Another useful feature of eMRCS is that you can compare how you did compared to others who are also doing eMRCS at the same time. So it shows you a graph of what the other users are doing, and from reading online it seems like the majority of people think that if you can aim to get above 70% on eMRCS, you're generally in kind of a safe area to tackle the actual exam. I personally completed this question bank 2.5 times, which included repeating all the wrong questions each time as well. And I think the first time I ran through it, I got something horrendous like 52% average, which was horrible, and I had to redo like 1,000 questions, which is all the ones that I got wrong. And then the second time round, I got around 70%, and again repeated all the ones I got wrong. And then this then brought me up to the kind of last 2 to 3 weeks before the actual exam, so I just kind of did quick fire third round of the questions without reading through too much of the information this time, and I was averaging about 92% right before I took the actual exam. And then there was Pastest. So I bought Pastest after I already finished the eMRCS question bank about 1.5 times, because I thought I should try other questions that I haven't seen before. However, I found that sort of in line with most people's feedback about Pastest, I found it to be less representative of the actual style and content of the questions on the actual exam. And actually the question bank itself, although there are loads of questions on there, didn't really reflect the actual exam very well, or at least not as well as eMRCS did. Aside from the anatomy questions, which I found really useful to kind of reinforce my knowledge after reading about a specific anatomy system, everything else was just really niche and not often very applicable, so I ended up really not doing very much of those questions. The most useful thing about Pastest, however, which I will admit that eMRCS is lacking, which was super useful, was the fact that they have past papers of previous MRCS Part A exams. So on Pastest, you can access one past paper each from 2017, 2018, 2019, 20 and 21, and with a timer and everything. So it was essentially just a mock exam of previous papers, and they give you a pass mark as well of what you would expect from that exam. So it was a really good way to judge how well you were getting along and see what the questions are like in previous exams. This was particularly useful in the month sort of leading up to the exam, because at this point I've kind of learnt most of the things that I need to learn of eMRCS, and I've done that question bank a number of times. So on a weekend when I had more time, I would sit down and do the full mock exam. So I would do 3 hours of paper 1, take a break, and then do the 2 hours of paper 2 after. And then that meant that I was able to train sort of what I would be expected on the actual exam date in terms of how long I have to sit and stay focused on an exam paper, and it also just gives a really good idea of what the exam papers are like as well. Aside from the question banks, I did use some other resources as well to aid my studying, and as I mentioned earlier, especially anatomy was something that I personally really struggle to learn just from question banks. I feel like that's the kind of topic that I actually have to sit down and learn. And the kind of big hitters like the brachial plexus or the lumbosacral plexus or the anatomy of the neck or something, I just find it hard to pick apart that in just question banks. So I did use some extra resources to study. For online websites, Teach Me Anatomy was probably the biggest resource and the main resource that I used to learn all of my anatomy. It's just a really good website that is really easy to read. The information is concise and really relevant to the level of the MRCS Part A. The diagrams are really good, and it's just kind of well organized, bite-sized chunks of information. And honestly, it reads better than most of the anatomy books that I've ever read, so it was really useful in that regard. Another sort of useful resource that I personally didn't use so much, but I can see why it was super useful for everyone else, is Ackland's Anatomy, and this is essentially a collection of videos online which goes through dissection models, and I actually even think it's more useful for MRCS Part B, because you have to actually identify structures off of cadaveric images. But for Part A, where everything is quite wordy, I think Teach Me Anatomy is actually quite sufficient. And then in terms of books, the only one that I actually purchased for the MRCS Part A is this, the Basic Science for the MRCS, a revision guide for surgical trainees by Raftery. This is the one that most people seem to recommend as well. And this is a pretty good book. It essentially covers exactly what it says on the tin, so the basic sciences side of things, which is mainly just paper 1 of the exam, and that's split into basically anatomy, physiology and pathology. For anatomy, I actually didn't end up using this book very much because, as I said, Teach Me Anatomy was so good that I didn't actually feel like I need to use this, and I thought it was actually easier to read on Teach Me Anatomy as well. But the kind of physiology and pathology in this book was really useful overview of the kind of basics you need to know in order to pass the exam. And I think if you learn the majority of the physiology stuff in here, I don't think you need to read much more. It's all the very basic stuff you need to know for the exam, like lung function volumes or, gastric acids and stuff like that, which is all covered here, and that's great. Overall, I would say this is a pretty good book for paper 1, but definitely not enough to get you through the entire exam. Another sort of overview books that other people have talked about or used is the Pastest books for the MRCS Part A. I personally did not use this. I went to the library, flipped through them, and didn't feel that they were that useful. They were very wordy, and I didn't think that I could really get through them feasibly, in addition to doing the question banks and stuff. So I personally didn't use them, but some people did find it to be a good, and again, another kind of overview book of all the topics that you need to know. But I think for most people, you probably struggle to get through all of that in addition to doing everything else. To supplement my anatomy learning, I also kind of very infrequently, granted, use some anatomy books as well. This is especially true if I needed to read something in a lot more depth, and also embryology, which was something, the kind of only thing really that I felt was maybe a bit too brief on Teach Me Anatomy at times. So the ones that I used was Clinical Applied Anatomy by Ellis and Metahaven, which is actually the same book that they used in my medical school to teach us anatomy in year 1 and 2, so I already had it, and that was really useful. It's just quite easy to read, it's got good diagrams, and it explains everything really well, but on its own it's probably a bit too in-depth and too detailed for the MRCS, but it's useful if you want to read a bit more into certain things. And another anatomy book that I already had that I sometimes reference to was the Netter's Atlas of Human Anatomy. Again, I had this since I was in medical school, and this book doesn't really have a lot of text. It's basically just like a lot of plates of different anatomies with labeled diagrams, and it's really useful if you just want to kind of reference something in a diagram. I think, again, less useful for the MRCS Part A, really useful for overall general surgical knowledge, and really useful when you go to theatres and things in training outside of the exam, but just something that I use infrequently. So how much time do you actually need to revise for the MRCS Part A? This is clearly dependent on a lot of factors, like how you personally study, what your study habits are like, what stage of training are you in, and how much basic knowledge you already have, and also depends on what your current rotation in and how much actual time can you feasibly dedicate to studying. For most people, I think around 3 to 4 months time would be sufficient, but again, that depends. It's really important, I think, to take into account actually how much time you can dedicate to studying. So for example, someone working sort of an ED job with a lot of 12-hour shifts is going to have a lot less time or a lot less energy to spare for studying compared to someone who's on a 8 till 5 job with no nights. I was personally quite lucky in that I ended up studying for the MRCS Part A during rotation, where it was a lot less busy than I thought it was, so sometimes I can squeeze in a couple rounds of MCQs even during work hours, and this was a rotation where F1s don't do any night shifts at all, so again, that's kind of gave me a lot more routine and stability in terms of studying. And on most normal working days I can squeeze in about 2 hours maybe realistically after work. The key to kind of studying alongside a full-time job is just to be consistent, and that's really easier said than done, but aim to do a certain number of questions every night or a certain number of hours of studying every night, and then try and sort of slowly build that up over time up towards the exam. So I think I started off aiming to do 50 and not really managing even that at the start of my revision period, and then towards the end of it I was aiming to do sort of 100 every day. I would say pragmatically you should aim to at least finish one question bank, whether that's eMRCS or Pastest or something else, at least twice in completeness. If you wanted to be even more precise about planning to do the exam and how much time you need to study, I knew someone who sort of allocated 15 minutes per mark and then extrapolated how many marks can you expect to get from each category of the questions. So for example, it was like 75 marks for anatomy, and he would extrapolate, okay, 75 times 15 minutes, this is how much time I would need to study on anatomy total. Personally for me, I actually bought the question banks about 6 months before I actually sat the exam, because this was my first sitting. I had no idea what the questions would be like, so buying it early was basically just my way of not starting revision as such, but just giving myself time to get used to the expectation of what the questions will be like and what the format will be like. And I think I completed the question bank in sort of 2 to 3 months without going into too much depth in terms of reading the material that was there. And in December, so 4 months before the actual exam, I reset the question bank and I went through the questions a second time. And this time I did everything in much more depth, and I think it actually took me longer to complete the question bank like because I was trying to read so much around the topic and do all the anatomy on Teach Me Anatomy on the side away from the question bank as well. So it took me a really long time to go through the question bank a second time, but this is also where I saw the most significant increases in my score. And then with sort of a month to go to the exam, like I said earlier, I reset the eMRCS question bank a third time, having done all the repeat wrong questions, and I started focusing on doing proper mock exams on Pastest every weekend or longer study sessions to get myself ready for the actual format of the exam where I have to sit and do questions for a long time and focus. So those are the main resources I use and the timescale I used to study for the MRCS Part A personally. Finally, before we end the video, I thought I'd just throw in a few final exam day tips that I took away from my experience. The first tip is that prior to the actual exam, ensure that you actually run a simulated mock of the actual exam conditions. So like I said, whether this is via Pastest or whatever you want to use, just time yourself to do 3 hours of paper 1, take an hour break like you would in the actual day, and then do the 2-hour paper afterwards, and try and wake up at the right time as you would expect to on the actual day, and start your exam on the the same time as when you would expect to start it on the day. And I think that just gave me a much better preparation mentally about how long I actually have to sit in my chair in front of my desk and focus and not move. So I think that's just an important experience to do at least once, just to give yourself an idea of what it will be like. Second tip is, assuming the exams are still online, at least for the meantime, just check that your desk environment is set up optimally for the exam at least a couple of days before the actual event. Check that you'll be comfortable, so get some cushions for your seats if that's what you need, and make sure you kind of remove all the distractions around that could lead you to look away from your screen, because we know that the exam software will track your eyes when they record you during the exam. So if you look away from the screen, they will know, and it might get flagged up to be reviewed. So it's just something to keep in mind. And if you live with roommates or other people in the house, just make sure that they know to stay quiet during the day, because the exam software, aside from recording you the entire time of the exam, it will also record any noise. So any loud noises inside or outside your room, including from yourself, so don't talk during the exam. But if other people were talking outside, even if it's completely irrelevant or other noises that are in no way related to the exam, it could get flagged up. So just make sure that the environment is all set. And my final tip, again, this is assuming that the exam is online still, is to save the help desk hotline for the software somewhere other than your computer. Save it on your phone or a sticky post-it or something beforehand. And the reason I say this is because the exam software, in a kind of anti-cheating strategy, it will disable everything else on your computer. So whilst this software is open, you can't do anything else on your computer at all. So if you run into any problems, which happened to me and also a few of my colleagues, if you watched my other video, you would know what happened. It was a good job that I had everything accessible on my phone, saved and ready to go, because otherwise if I just put it on my computer or in my emails or something, I would not have been able to look at it so quickly. So just something to keep in mind, and anticipate these problems and prepare as best as you can. And that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been useful for those of you who are looking to take the MRCS Part A exam in the future. And if you liked it, please leave a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for future content as well. That's it for now, and I'll see you next time.